The story everyone in Washington is pretending not to see is that we are watching a former president collide head on with the most immovable object in American power, the Constitution itself. And that collision is now happening inside the Supreme Court. You are being told this is just another procedural dispute, another technical delay, another footnote in an endless legal drama, but that is wrong. What is unfolding right now is a fundamental test of whether the United States is still a nation of laws or whether it has slid into the kind of personalized rule we spend decades trying to prevent in other countries. Donald Trump built his entire post presidency survival strategy around one reckless assumption that the court he reshaped would ultimately bend to him when it mattered most. That assumption is now cracking in real time, and the political shockwaves are enormous. Trump appointed three of these justices. He spent years telling his supporters that the court was his, that it was loyal to him, that it was the last fortress standing between him and accountability. That belief has been the backbone of every delay tactic, every motion, every appeal, every press release screaming about absolute immunity. But the Supreme Court does not exist to protect political careers. It exists to protect the constitutional order, and when those two collide, only one survives. What the justices are signaling now is that they understand exactly what is at stake, not just for this defendant, but for every future president, every future election, and the credibility of American democracy itself. Here is what officially happened. Trump went to the Supreme Court asking them to step in and freeze the criminal process against him by endorsing his claim that a former president cannot be prosecuted for acts taken while in office. That is not a narrow legal argument. That is a claim to permanent immunity, a claim that would effectively place the presidency above the law. If that theory were accepted, it would mean a president could order crimes, abuse power, and then walk away untouched so long as those actions were dressed up as official business. The justices know what that would mean. It would turn the Oval Office into something dangerously close to a throne. The signals coming out of the court are not subtle. By hesitating to intervene, by allowing lower court rulings rejecting this immunity theory to stand, even temporarily, the justices are telling Trump that his legal fantasy is not being treated as a serious constitutional principle. Every day they decline to rescue him, the clock moves forward on trials he has been desperate to push past the election. That is why he is panicking. Delay has always been the real strategy. If he could just run out the clock, if he could just get back into office, he believed he could make it all go away. The Supreme Court is now standing in the way of that plan. And that is why this moment matters so much more than most people realize. This is not about one filing or one procedural ruling. This is about whether the American system still has the backbone to tell a powerful man no when he demands to be treated like a king. What happens next will determine whether the law applies to everyone or only to the people without enough money, influence, or ambition to challenge it. Trump's behavior in this fight tells you everything you need to know about how desperate the situation has become for him. He is not arguing the facts of the cases anymore because he knows how ugly they are. He is not even really arguing the law in any serious way. He is arguing time. Every motion, every appeal, every dramatic claim of persecution is designed to stretch the calendar, not to win on the merits. And the Supreme Court is the last gate he thought he could force open. If that gate stays closed, everything else starts collapsing. The reason his immunity argument is so dangerous is not just because it would protect him, it would permanently poison the American presidency. If a president can never be charged for crimes committed in office, then there is no real deterrent against abuse of power. Elections alone are not enough. We have seen around the world what happens when leaders realize they can break the law and still hold on to their freedom if they just control the system long enough. That is how democracies rot from the inside out. The justices know this history. They understand that their decision here will echo far beyond one election cycle. Lower courts have already rejected Trump's immunity claim in blunt terms, making it clear that the Constitution does not create a lawless zone around the presidency. The Supreme Court now has to decide whether it will uphold that principle or quietly gut it by stepping in to rescue him. So far, they are showing every sign of being unwilling to take that leap. Even a delay in acting is, in this context, a decision because it allows the legal process to continue. And for Trump, The legal process moving forward is the nightmare he has been trying to avoid. This is why his public rhetoric has become more frantic and more extreme. He is not just fighting prosecutors, he is fighting the slow, grinding machinery of the rule of law, a system designed to move methodically and deliberately, not at the speed of a campaign rally. He thought he could overwhelm it with noise and political pressure. What he is discovering instead is that institutions like the Supreme Court care deeply about their own legitimacy. They know that if they create a special carve out for one man, especially one as polarizing as Trump, they will destroy the court's credibility for generations. And that is the part of this story that should give you some cautious optimism. The justices may disagree on many things, but they all have a vested interest in preserving the authority of the court itself. If they are seen as bending the law to serve a single political figure, the damage to that authority would be profound. That is why, behind all the technical language and procedural maneuvering, you can see a deeper calculation taking place. The court is weighing not just Trump's fate, but its own. Once you understand that dynamic, you can see why this moment feels so different from all the other legal skirmishes Trump has survived. In the past, he could count on chaos, on confusion, on divided institutions tripping over themselves, but here he is facing something much more disciplined. The Supreme Court is not a cable news panel. It does not respond to outrage cycles or social media pressure. It responds to precedent, to institutional survival, and to the long shadow of history. And history is full of examples of what happens when courts decide to protect rulers instead of law. Trump's entire political brand has been built on the idea that he is untouchable, that he can do things no one else can do and get away with them. That myth has been incredibly powerful for him. It has kept allies loyal and enemies cautious. But myths only last as long as institutions are willing to tolerate them. What is happening now is that the most powerful legal institution in the country is quietly refusing to play along. By not rushing to validate his immunity claim, they are signaling that the presidency is not a shield against accountability. If this appeal fails, or even if it simply drags on without the relief he wants, Trump's nightmare becomes reality. Trials move forward, juries get seated, evidence gets presented. All the things he has spent years trying to keep out of the courtroom finally come into the light. That is what he fears more than anything else, because once that process starts, it is no longer something he can spin away with slogans or rallies. It becomes a story told by documents, testimony, and legal standards. This is also why his supporters are being told that the court is betraying him. That narrative is not about law, it is about maintaining loyalty in the face of a looming loss. If Trump goes down, it cannot be because the system worked. It has to be because the system was rigged. That is the only way to preserve the political movement he has built. But the Supreme Court, by sticking to its role, is refusing to validate that story. It is forcing the confrontation between power and law into the open. And that confrontation is something America has had to face before. Every time a leader tries to place himself above the rules, the country reaches a crossroads. One path leads toward accountability and stability. The other leads toward something much darker, where loyalty to a person replaces loyalty to principles. What the court does in this moment will tell us which path we are really on. Let me take that one step further, because this is where the gravity of what is happening really comes into focus. The immunity theory Trump is pushing is not some quirky legal footnote. It is a blueprint for permanent, unaccountable power. If the Supreme Court were to embrace it, every future president would know that as long as they can frame their actions as official duties, there is no criminal line they cannot cross. Ordering illegal surveillance, silencing opponents, manipulating elections, even directing violence through state power, could all be wrapped in the language of governance and shielded forever. That is not a hypothetical. That is exactly how modern authoritarian systems operate. And the American system was designed explicitly to prevent that outcome. The justices understand that they are not just refereeing one man's legal fight. They are writing a rule book that will govern the presidency for generations. And that is why their reluctance to intervene on Trump's behalf matters so much. By letting lower court decisions rejecting immunity remain in force, they are preserving a basic but essential truth. that no office in this country is above the law. That principle is easy to say and very hard to enforce when the person invoking immunity is a former president with a massive political following. Yet, this is precisely the moment when it has to be enforced, or it becomes meaningless. Trump, for his part, knows exactly how high the stakes are. That is why he keeps returning to the idea that prosecutions against him are not just unfair, but illegitimate. He has to delegitimize the process itself, because if the process is legitimate, then so are the consequences. His entire political survival strategy depends on convincing millions of people that the justice system has no authority over him. The Supreme Court, by refusing to rush to his defense, is quietly but decisively rejecting that premise. And here is the uncomfortable truth: the court does not need to issue a dramatic ruling to devastate Trump's strategy. All it has to do is nothing. By declining to pause the proceedings, by allowing the trials to move forward, it ensures that time, which Trump thought was his greatest weapon, becomes his greatest enemy. Every week that passes without Supreme Court intervention is another week closer to a jury, another week closer to testimony, another week closer to a verdict that no amount of political messaging can undo. This is why this moment feels like the air has shifted. The noise is still there, the rallies, the headlines, the outrage, but underneath it all, the machinery of accountability is grinding forward. And once that machinery really starts moving, it does not stop just because a powerful man demands that it should. Let me push that even further, because this is where the political and legal worlds really start to collide. When the Supreme Court refuses to become Trump's shield, it sends a signal far beyond the courtroom. It tells every power broker, every party operative, every donor, and every would be ally that the old assumption of permanent impunity is gone. For years, Trump's gravitational pull came from one simple belief: that he would always survive, that he would always escape, that backing him was never truly risky because somehow the system would fold. Once that belief starts to crack, everything around him begins to realign. You're already seeing the early tremors of that shift. People who once hitched their futures to him are now watching the legal calendar with a kind of quiet dread. They know that indictments and trials do not just create headlines, they create facts, testimonies, sworn statements, and verdicts. Those are things no political spin machine can erase. The Supreme Court, by not stepping in to stop the process, is making those facts inevitable. That is why this moment is so destabilizing. It turns uncertainty into a forward moving force. From the court's perspective, this is about survival as an institution. The justices know that if they intervene to save Trump, they will forever be seen as a political body rather than a judicial one. Their rulings would be questioned, their motives doubted, and their authority weakened in every future crisis. By standing back and letting the lower courts do their work, they are protecting the one thing that gives them real power: the belief that they are guardians of law, not instruments of any one man. Trump, of course, has built his entire political identity on the opposite idea. He has told his supporters that the system is rigged, that courts are tools of his enemies, and that only he stands between them and chaos. That narrative depends on him always being able to beat the system. The Supreme Court's refusal to rescue him threatens to expose that narrative as hollow. If he ends up in front of a jury, all the talk of witch hunts and deep states collides with the reality of evidence and procedure. And that collision is what makes this so explosive. It is not just a legal reckoning, it is a test of whether a movement built on personal loyalty can survive contact with an institution that does not care who you are. The Supreme Court is not perfect, but in this moment, it is doing something profoundly important. It is reminding the country that power has limits, that offices do not grant immunity, and that the law is not a favor that can be granted or withdrawn. That reminder, delivered quietly through inaction, may turn out to be the most consequential thing it has done in years. What we are witnessing is not simply a legal showdown between Donald Trump and a set of prosecutors. It is a confrontation between two competing ideas of how power works in America. Trump's idea is that power flows from personal loyalty, intimidation, and political force. The Constitution's idea is that power flows from institutions, rules, and limits that apply no matter who you are. Those two ideas can coexist only until someone decides to test them. Trump has been testing them for years. Now, the Supreme Court is finally forcing a reckoning by refusing to bless his claim of absolute immunity or to shut down the legal process on his behalf. The court is doing something deceptively simple but historically profound. It is treating him like a former office holder, not a monarch. That distinction matters more than most people realize. In countries where leaders become untouchable, where courts hesitate to act because of fear or politics, corruption and abuse metastasize. The United States has avoided that fate precisely because at critical moments its institutions have been willing to say no. That is why Trump's panic is so visible. He understands that a jury is the one audience he cannot control. He cannot threaten it. He cannot charm it. He cannot drown it out with rallies. In a courtroom, his story has to compete with documents, testimony, and legal standards. And when the Supreme Court refuses to stop that process, it is telling him that his old weapons no longer work. This is also why this moment sends such a powerful signal to the rest of the political system. It tells every ambitious politician watching that the presidency is not a permanent shield. It tells every would-be strongman that there is a price for pushing too far. That kind of signal is how democracies protect themselves, not through force, but through the credible threat of accountability. So when people ask why this matters, the answer is simple. It matters because the rule of law only exists if it is enforced when it is hardest to enforce. It is easy to apply the law to the weak. It is much harder to apply it to the powerful. The Supreme Court, by holding its ground, is choosing the harder path. And that is the ultimate irony of Trump's situation. He spent years claiming that he alone could save America from a corrupt system. What he is now discovering is that the system he tried to bend is stronger than he is. Slow, flawed, and imperfect, yes, but still strong enough to tell even a former president that the rules apply to him too.